The editor of Reason, editor at large at Reason, Matt Welch, is with us, and constitutional law attorney Jenna Ellis. Jenna, let me just ask you about the constitutional part of this, because it's interesting that all 9 justices came to this agreement, and Justice Thomas, Gorsuch, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but apparently they use different parts of the Constitution to come to this conclusion. So what does that mean ultimately when they have to maybe decide on a pure civil forfeiture case?
Yeah, and it was interesting that although it was a 9-0 decision, Thomas and Gorsuch provided legal rationale in their concurrences that were slightly different than Ruth Bader Ginsburg's majority. And all that means for future appellate cases is that they can potentially argue separate legal questions under the theories of the concurrences, which basically just said that under the 14th Amendment's Privileges and Immunities Clause, that there should be protection for citizens' private property. But with the due process clause that Justice Ginsburg was referring to, that's really going to be the majority holding. So I think this is a win-win for private citizens, and certainly the state should not be able to seize private property without due process. And I would also agree with Thomas and Gorsuch that the 14th Amendment is also sound legal rationale.
Of course, Matt, whenever this topic comes up, I say, get me Matt Welch. So I'm glad you made it.
Thank you. We've been talking about this at Reason for 4 decades, basically.
Yeah, I mean, are you encouraged now that maybe this is going to speed up the process that ultimately gets some more fairness in this process?
Yes, and I hope it emboldens Trump's Justice Department and the Trump administration itself, which is pushing through, with Jared Kushner, a lot of criminal justice reform, sometimes over the Justice Department's stated desires, which is pretty interesting to see. The Justice Department is part of the problem here. They have been cooperating with local police departments in sort of sharing and redistributing this money, encouraging, incentivizing them to take, and let's be clear about this, in the worst case, civil asset forfeiture is legalized theft by the cops. And I know that sounds harsh, but they're saying that your watch is guilty even though you're not. And you drove through this checkpoint, and I saw that watch. Let's look at pretty fancy. I'm going to take it from you. And we don't even have to charge you with a crime. OK, that's crazy. So the Justice Department can, by itself, with instruction, end that program of sharing, which would go a long way to reduce this. I would also like to see states and potentially the federal government get in there and pass laws just to say, hey, look, you can use civil asset forfeiture when you've convicted someone of a crime, but not when you have accused them and not when you haven't even accused them.
So essentially, a lot of times people are arrested, their stuff is taken, they're let go, but they never get their stuff back. I mean, in pure layman's terms. So what about police officers, though? In these small police departments, I've spoken to enough law enforcement folks, enough sheriffs who admit, we need this money or you won't have law enforcement.
Well, what you say is you need to convince your local polities, you need to convince the local city hall and other people to fund you the correct way. You don't want to incentivize police to shake down their own citizenry in order to pay for their offense. That's a bad incentive structure.
Even if they're shaking down bad guys, potentially bad guys.
Even if they're shaking down, you want police to enforce the laws equally on people based on their criminality, not on their ability to provide money to the police department.
Jenna, we got less than a minute to go, but if you can handicap for us the idea that ultimately the Supreme Court will take this on and maybe rule in a way that will make Matt Welch and a whole lot of people happy.
Yeah, and I think everyone's happy here, and I agree with everything that Matt said. I mean, the issue now that's going to have to be decided is what really constitutes excessive fines, and that's why this case is going to now go back to Indiana and will determine, will a $42,000 imposition for something that this defendant was actually the worst offense and fine he could have been convicted of was $10,000. So this is really over 4 times the amount. Is that really proportional to the offense? And so I think this is going to boil down legally to proportionality, what constitutes an excessive fine, and we shouldn't be funding law enforcement based on them stealing from us, just like Matt said. So I think this is a really good outcome for everyone involved here.
Jenna, Matt, thank you both very much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Well, Apple and Goldman Sachs are teaming up to issue credit